Hi everyone, it's Sandra here outside with Gilligan. And Gilligan, my lovely converted turtle-shaped sandbox worm bin, has gotta go. I have pre-composted bedding ready for Gilligan. I was gonna bait out the worms with all those Starbucks cups and do multiple baiting to get the worms out, but time's run out, Gilligan. I didn't do it. So that means I'm just going to pull this and I'm going to put them in these styrofoam food grade storage totes. And so Gilligan, the worm bin, is going to be moving from here to here and get this bin out of the way, because nobody, sadly, wants to buy our house with a worm bin with about 10,000 worms in it sitting next to my back door. So I'm going to start pulling worms from Gilligan, pulling vermicompost from Gilligan. I'm not going to sift it. It's just all going in these totes. All the stuff on the top here is large chunk material that the worms haven't gone through yet. So this first tote, I imagine, is going to be very much these avocado pits and everything that are in the throes of being worked on. The dry material on the surface that was just too dry to be vermicomposted. And I assume as I go deeper in the bin, I will progressively find material that is finished. And so each tote is going to be unique. I'm going to put a space saver in that tote. So I will always have a space at the end. I'm just putting a box at the end to save some room. So I'm just going to be, with my bare hands, this is beautiful vermicompost. I'm just going to be pulling out the large, this avocado pit's been opened, but I'm just going to be putting stuff in in Gilligan's totes. So yeah, there's Gilligan's worms. They're feeding into some corn husks, but they'll be going in here. They'll love it in here. It'll feel familiar. First, I really want to thank the online community who I asked, how am I going to move this? How am I going to move these gorgeous worms out of Gilligan? And I got so many great suggestions. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put paragraphs on the screen of the advice I was given about how to move Gilligan safely, how to get the worms out, how to move him eventually to our new home. That is about a 4-hour drive away. So watch the screen and you'll see the play-by-play of all the advice I got.
So William said, part of the population balance and natural cycle is that worms die and are consumed by the bin very quickly, hence why you rarely see dead worms. Based on your situation, I'd go the overcrowding route and be prepared for a bit of extra time for populations to reestablish in Gilligan, as well as any totes you split to restore Gilligan. Don't bank on excess population in your totes surviving multiple months. You can likely, however, rely on excess worms feeding your totes through the transition given adequate bedding. Lastly, if you can harvest castings from Gilligan prior to the move, they can be dried down quite a bit more than active systems while still retaining microbe activity. Worms like 80 to 90% moisture with a minimum 60%, right? I think castings can be dried to 10 to 15% before there is much concern of quality loss, so you may get some added portability there. Catano said, I'd say start a single large tote and move them in. It'll be a lot, yes, but worms self-regulate pretty good and they'll slow on reproduction until they're back with more space, but should be fine for a couple of months. Or sell off some worms locally via marketplace and just keep some to restart once you're settled. Jane added, the large totes get really heavy fast. You'd need a fair number of totes. If you harvest the castings first and leave the castings behind, then that would reduce the number of totes needed for just the worms and enough bedding to keep them going until you can reset up Gilligan at your new place. John said, that per square foot only applies to a breeding system. If you are looking for castings, then put them in existing bins. They just won't breed, and they will end up being skinnier and lots of castings. You don't need any more worms till you get settled. Make up some worm chow before you move. Sean advised me, going to a smaller bin will reduce their numbers significantly. Not too big of a deal, I guess, but keep in mind you'll have to work to build their population back up. Best thing would be to use multiple totes to move them, but that wouldn't necessarily be practical for you. Amy cautioned me, I would put them in 2 to 3 totes. I frequently put my worms in a different tote/bin when I am harvesting/changing my setup. I would hate to diminish the numbers too much because you will want those worms and compost on the new property. Also, you never know which bin might get left in a bad location, for example, in the full sun with no ventilation while you are moving. Having them in an extra couple of totes would certainly be helpful in the situations I somehow always find myself in when moving. Tom brings up some good points. He says, I've left bare worms in a pail for hours. Your 10 pounds would be fine in 1 tote, but use 2 totes for safety. By the way, they will need to make a fast recovery. I suggest that you have great pre-composted bedding ready for them. Finally, he asks, do they have to move on the same day? So I got some great advice from the members of the Red Worm Composting Facebook group. You know, if you raise worms, the YouTube worm community as well as the Facebook worm communities are great sources of advice, and everyone is so willing to help. I had Gilligan, this massive system, almost ready to harvest when we decided to move, and I was in a quandary. If I harvested now, I would have worms, but no bedding that they would be familiar with. And where would they go? And I posed that question to the Red Worm Composting Facebook group and said, how do I do this? They gave me the advice to split up in multiple totes. Now, I decided not to harvest first. As you can see, I just pulled the vermicompost out. That was more a matter of my running out of time rather than not taking their advice. Had I had the opportunity to harvest and get these worms established in those styrofoam totes in new bedding, I would have done so. I had the pre-composted bedding ready to go, but I had to do this. This whole process took me 90 minutes, and Gilligan was off the back doorstep and safely tucked behind the garage. So what you see me doing here is dividing Gilligan's vermicompost up into 7 totes in total. Worms and all go in here. They essentially became worm bins, and I took advantage of my sister being over here and her husband bringing a truck and sent these worms in these totes home with my sister to worm sit until Landon and I are established in our new home. That might not be until July, so I'm really relying on my sister to feed and care for Gilligan's worms, give them some new bedding, some new compost to keep them going, and when I get back, and hopefully we'll be in our new home by July, I will start Gilligan up again. These styrofoam totes are lightweight, so Jane's suggestion of not making the totes too heavy in case we have to move around was a great one. Styrofoam, they're very light. Also, dividing them up into multiple bins means that, you know, if one of them gets tipped over accidentally, if one of them gets dehydrated accidentally, I'm not going to lose my entire worm population. They're also not going to be subject to as much overcrowding because they're divided up into multiple totes.
I am a little concerned that these worms are living in nearly finished vermicompost, and so I'm relying on my sister to keep giving them some new bedding. She says she's got some great compost that the worms in her property really love. So she's going to be topping these bins up with some of her compost and leaf mold and giving them some food scraps. But these are hungry worms. She's got to feed her own worms, so I hope she has some food scraps left over for Gilligan. But anyway, when I get back and have Gilligan assembled, I will finally feel like I'm home on our new property. I'll just continue to fast forward this video as I pull out this vermicompost handful by handful. Boy, was my hand ever tired by the end of this. After I pulled out the very last worm, I rinsed off Gilligan into our garden mulch just in case I missed a wisp or two, and gave each of the totes some of that pre-compost bedding and a good healthy feeding in that space that I saved at the end of each tote. Then they all got trucked off by Wendy and her husband to their new temporary home, and I hope to be reunited with Gilligan and his worms when we get safely settled in our new home sometime over the next few months. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll just let the music play as I finish emptying Gilligan. Bye for now.